So, hello everybody. Welcome to episode what is now 22 of my podcast. And this time, I'm very pleased to welcome Richard Coutts, co-founder and director of BACA Architects, London-based, but working on projects around the globe. Richard, thank you very much for joining us today, and please tell our listeners about who you are and your practice and so on and so forth.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introductions. Sort of a lot of people may know our work, others may not, but we specialise in projects which are fundamentally in, on, near, or underwater. These tend to be places which are either located in the floodplain, or at the other sort of side of the coin for us, we focus on leisure and hospitality. So in terms of our work, we sort of look at it in sort of two tranches, either water as a threat.
Mm-hmm.
So what we tend to find is people approach the practice who have bought a house or are currently living in the floodplain. So they will have issues with flood issues, whereby their houses may have been flooded during recent events, or that their neighbours have been flooded recently.
Okay.
And so we get asked, is there another way of living with water? So currently, or people build in a very traditional manner. They build a sort of solid house. It sits on the ground, and they hope that that ground level might be high enough to avoid floodwaters. Now, with climate change, we're finding that there's more rainwater in the rivers, which means that when we have big storm events, the river levels are much higher, and they're breaching over people's gardens and now into their living rooms. And that
Okay.
causes, terrible distress to many people, because I think the insurance sector were reporting that, on average, it costs the homeowner, or the insurance sector, about £30,000 in claims.
Yeah.
But that's not just the whole story. Many of those people then find themselves having to live in hotels whilst their houses are being repaired. That's disruptive for children at school.
Of
It's
course.
disruptive for people for jobs, and it's also quite distressing because many of your homes and valuables are located within these premises which are badly affected.
Mm.
So we did a piece of work for the British government for DEFRA almost a decade ago,
Yeah.
and it was called the LIFE project. So LIFE stands for Long-Term Initiatives for Flood Risk Environments.
Okay.
And it kind of looked at all the different challenges that we need to do whilst we either live in existing homes near the river or building new homes. So on one hand, we acknowledge that we need to build more homes. I think the current government are facing that challenge. Where can we build? Ideally, we don't want to be building in the floodplain, but equally, we don't want urban sprawl building out into the greenbelt.
Mm.
So our work is mainly focused on people who are living in the floodplain.
Okay.
We want to build environmentally, so we want to make sure that our buildings are as low carbon as possible, so don't exacerbate
Mm-hmm.
climate change. And equally, we want people to feel safe and secure, and we need to build these homes in a cost-effective way. So the work that we did for government, we took 3 sites, one in the upper catchment, so where the source of the water is,
Yeah.
one in the middle catchment, so it will have rained for a large period of time. There'll be a significant body of water within the river,
Yeah.
but you have a little bit of notice for when that water arrives. And then the lower catchment, where you've got even more water that's gathered and made
Mm.
its way down this river course. But equally, when it hits the coastline, if, for example, we've had a spring tide, you have a thing which is called tide lock, where you've got sea level rise,
Yeah.
and the water that wants to flow out is actually stopped by high sea level at the other side.
Okay.
So in terms of our approach, we try to sort of make space for water, which is a philosophy that we've sort of borrowed from Holland. In Holland, it's called room for the river. And with that, we know that rivers need to flood and Mother Nature will make its way. And actually, that was most recently prevalent in Valencia, where they had redirected the river. And actually, all of those man-made interventions were slightly foolhardy, in that Mother Nature took its own natural line and flooded large parts of the city. So what we try to do with our work is use landscape initially, and it's a very common sense approach.
Mm.
Can we locate the houses in areas of least vulnerability?
Yep.
And you'll see this over and over again in the history books. Every cathedral or church is often built on the highest land. So our ancestors knew where to build.
Yeah.
And you'll find many of the streets are called Flood Lane, Water Lane, Lower
Yes.
Field Farm, Sea View. There's clues in the names that these areas are lower levels and are likely to flood. But as humans, we love to live by water. We're very attracted to the ebb and the flow, the reflections, the distant views. Water is a very beautiful thing, and many of the biologists, uh, you know, link that to that our human bodies are 80% of water or so.
Yeah.
So to begin with, we look at the landscape. Can we build in a safe location? So we make space for water. Then the next thing we do is kind of where is the key infrastructure? Because one of the key elements of our philosophy is, can people go to work day in, day out? So we call it continuity of daily life.
Okay.
Can they go to work when there's a flood event? We know that the story of the railway lines. There's a little bit of snow or leaves on the track and everything grinds to a halt. We're advocating, can you make a community work, plan it in a way that everybody in the event of a bad storm, can we still go to work? So that's another key element.
Okay.
So we'll use, for example, roads which can be expensive. We'll use that as a partial flood defence, or we'll use the road linked to a piece of amenity space, which could be a park. We couple these assets together so there's a less of a burden on the taxpayer.
Okay.
And then finally, we look at architecture. What can we do in terms of the building? So can we elevate the ground floor? That's an option. Now, the Environment Agency, when you build a new building or replace a building, they have very, very detailed flood maps. And what we would say to any of your viewers is that if you are looking to buy a home, you can log on to the Environment Agency website, type in flood maps Environment Agency. You can type in your postcode or proposed postcode into that, and it will give you the likelihood of how often that site may flood.
Okay. Good
And
advice. Yeah.
so that's that. I mean, we're doing ourselves out of work by mentioning
Yeah.
that, but
And you'll be surprised. I bet an awful lot of people don't know or to think to do that.
no, I mean it
I
always.
wouldn't personally, for example.
No, I mean you'll find it as like a little subline in the solicitor's pack, but it could save you tens of thousands of
Absolutely.
pounds.
Yeah. Yeah.
But say, for example, you have a house on an existing site and therefore you can't go anywhere else. So there's a number of solutions available. So you can create a sort of a defended situation. So you build sort of little flood defences around the house.
Yeah.
Now, they are good up to sort of knee height. So, 1.5, 2 foot.
Yeah.
And will hold water out. But sort of structure is only good up to a certain point. So it's putting a lot of pressure on those defences, and often rivers now will exceed those. So it's just an early form of defence.
Okay.
The other way if you identify that the floodwaters may exceed that, then you can design your house to be wet proof, and by that we mean that you allow water to come into the property. So, for example, if you have a kitchen, you would, instead of having that as sort of chipboard or wood, which will just swell and become it will become just debris and quite damaged during a flood, you might find some more robust materials.
Okay.
Equally, on the ground floor, instead of having carpets, you might go for stone floors. And then things like your utilities, so your electrics, you would actually bring in from higher level and feed down, and the same with your heating system, so that they're elevated out of what would be frequent flood levels.
Yeah.
Now, the benefit of that is then when a flood occurs, your house gets wet. In Dordrecht, they have a lovely system where some of the houses have like little pulleys up on the system, so you can rig your sofas up and out of the water. And in some of the properties, they actually have the kitchen like on a sort of a half mezzanine floor, which means that the lounge area can flood. You lift your furniture up into the kitchen area, and the rest is dry.
Yeah.
Now, in England, our building regs are slightly different in that we need to provide level access all the way throughout. So I think, again, in terms of policy, there's some thinking there that needs to be done in what's the higher need in those locations? Is it disabled access throughout, or if you have a house in the floodplain, is it safety of people, and can you sort of integrate ramps?
Yeah.
So you can design the house to anticipate flooding for the water to flow in, and then after the flood event recedes, you go in, you hose it down. Because your heating's from above, you switch all that on, it dries it out quite quickly, and you return back to use.
Okay.
So that's what you can do sort of with existing properties. Now, the next step then is to create elevated properties. And by that, we mean creating small stilts, and you raise the ground floor half a meter or so above the ground plane.
Okay.
So that's the next best cost-effective solution, which in some locations, if your ground floor is reasonably low to the existing garden, then that's wonderful. But in some locations, like for example over in the Florida Keys, there's the whole housing estate whereby all of these houses are 2-3 meters up in the air,
Yeah.
and they look quite peculiar because they're designed to anticipate a flood event that might happen once every 50 years or 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
But for those 49 years, they look like little aliens up on stilts.
Yeah.
And it's kind of people, stick washing machines under them. They park their cars. It becomes full of wood chippings, kids' bikes.
Yeah.
It's just not very attractive. So there is a third solution which we've now built. We're on to our third one of these, which is called an amphibious house.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the architectural design which we're probably best known for.
Yeah.
I think it featured on Grand Designs just over a decade or so ago. I think it's one of their most visited designs.
Yeah.
Now, an amphibious house is a house that can sit on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
and it means that the ground level is at a very similar height to the garden.
Okay.
So, for example, if you imagine a stilted house, now they're great in that they keep the house out of the water. But if you're elderly, or if it's in the winter, these steps get frosty, and if you're carrying a load of shopping up and down, it does present a few issues.
Yeah.
Now, the benefit of an amphibious house, when you glance at it from the river, it looks like a normal house. It's got 4 walls, a lovely pitched roof. It's quintessentially very English.
Yeah.
But the benefit of an amphibious house is it actually has a concealed basement. We call it the flotation unit,
Okay.
and that sits below the ground floor. Now, in the event of a flood through Archimedes' principle, that will give you sufficient buoyancy to lift the house.
Okay.
As and when that site floods, working with the engineers, we will calculate a point by which the house will start to move.
Okay.
So the benefit for the inhabitants is you can have wonderful furniture, or your lovely keepsakes, everything that you have in a normal home. But in the event of a flood, the house will slowly rise and keep the house at a safe distance from the floodwaters. And then after the floods recede,
Mm-hmm.
the house will then sink or sit back into its docking station.
Okay.
And we built one of these, I think, just over a decade ago over in Marlow. And I think the site has had 2 sort of moderate floods during that period, and it's performed well. All the inhabitants are safe and dry. The only sad thing in that situation is obviously you get to see your neighbours' houses flood, but we're hoping that as this technology becomes more commonplace, then we'll just see a lot more of these riverfront houses replaced with this sort of approach.
That's your main aim out of the 3 scenarios we've described. That's how you would like to see things go. Is that right? That's.
I think so. I think there's lots of riverfront properties. The benefit of the amphibious house means that you don't have to. Your ridge height of your property remains quite low. If you
Yeah.
put your house up on stilts, then you have one house or one neighbour's house which is
Yeah.
much lower, which is still the traditional, and then you've suddenly got this modern house elevated up in the air, and it creates sort of disparity within the riverfront.
Yeah.
And so the amphibious house gives you the benefit of preserving this beautiful Sylvian riverfront whilst maintaining ridge heights which are low, but as and when it's called upon during these flood events, the buildings can perform as intended.
Sounds fabulous. Yeah. That's and as you say, quite rightly, one of Grand Design's 10 or so years ago most visited projects. So it's it's clearly your USP, and it's all credit to you. So with the with the practice itself, you're based in London, but you obviously work. We've discussed some of your projects from around the world that you've done previously. Talk more about that. Some of your overseas work.
No, indeed. So a lot of our clients find us because of our work with water.
Yeah.
And what we're finding now is when you look globally, there are 20 or 30 cities and kind of archipelago islands as well, like the Maldives,
Yeah.
that are facing this existential threat from sea level rise. In these areas, the what we tend to find is people are looking at leisure and hospitality, so luxury resorts. The site that we're looking at in the Maldives, has the most beautiful turquoise seas,
Yeah.
surrounded by coral. As an architect, wonderful to go there for a
Yeah.
site visit.
Yep.
Uh,
Well, let me
but
know next time you're going. So.
indeed, um, but what we have to do then with those designs is to try and create something whereby it's sort of a low carbon solution.
Hmm.
We're looking at how we can create overwater developments. So some of these lovely lodges are either on stilts or floating.
Mm-hmm.
And then within the developments, say the Maldives is about 100 units around the perimeter of the island. At its heart is a wonderful clubhouse with pool, and then there's 5 hospitality restaurants. But underpinning all of this, there's the biomass heating system, so that we're taking coconut husks, burning those so that they will actually generate electricity on site. We're looking at
Okay.
floating solar panels on water. So this is quite a new execution of solar panels,
Okay.
and they come to us to create something whereby we are protecting them from floodwaters.
Yep.
It's underpinned by a very strong sustainability initiative, and then as architects, our role is to create something which is truly beautiful. So the lodges are a sort of a, and it's not an extraction, but it's an abstraction of a manta fish that you see, so the dorsal fin. So these buildings have this wonderful silhouette.
Yep.
We're working with local tradesmen to look at building these out of bamboo. We're trying to do this sort of create high-end luxury, but building it out of traditional materials with traditional workmen. So that's quite exciting. And then
How
over in
far is this project through to completion now? Are you kind of part way
so
through,
we
or?
so we're at the ideation stage of this at the moment. So
Yeah.
it's at a very early feasibility stage. We have to work with the local authorities in terms of the ecology and how the development can work sensitively within its environment.
Mm-hmm.
But these islands have been identified by the government for development.
Okay.
And then where were we? We're over in Australia. So we've been looking there at an underwater visitor centre. So it's an aquarium which is located 2 kilometres out to sea. It's at the end of a Victorian pier, so very similar to Southend Pier. You take a little train, it takes you out to the end,
Right.
and
Where
at
in
the end,
Australia is this? Is this
it's in Busselton. So it's in Perth, which
Perth?
is I
Okay.
think
Yeah.
the third largest city in Australia. So we're on the
On the west coast. Yeah.
west coast there. And the building itself, or also the underwater building, it's sat, as I say, just 8 meters below water level. And we have
Okay.
this large glass plate window, and then visitors will be able to put on the diving helmets with the umbilical cords
Right.
and walk around the seabed. So, and then for school children, they'll be able to do sleepovers, which will be underwater. So it'll be like
Fabulous.
night in the
Yeah.
museum, but it'll be actually underwater. So we're quite excited about that. And then taking us over to the Red Sea,
Mm-hmm.
we're looking at developing hotels and spas there, and that's quite exciting because Saudi Arabia at the moment is getting a lot of press for these very high profile projects,
Yeah.
but the schemes that we're working are designed or targeted at a domestic audience.
Okay.
And so we have a wonderful female CEO working for that we're working for out in Saudi, and she's leading a sort of design in terms of local culture. So the area is called Jambu. And so there'll be a visitor centre there explaining some of the heritage. There's an area called Yambo Al Nakal, which is one of the oldest settlements in history, which is in a wadi, and we understand that that will be rejuvenated, brought back to life, and you can go and visit there.
Okay.
You'll be able to camp out in the desert, so we've been looking at structures for the desert. But at the waterfront, the big building it's a visitor centre, so it's a part museum, part marina. So that's on one of the peninsulas. On the second peninsula is a spa with a series of lodges. So they're over the water. We've got these lovely cascading water terraces, these uh, these vistas of water which look out over the horizon, frame the view, so you can be able to sit out there in your
Wow.
cabana, drinking your G&T, looking
Yeah.
over the horizon. And it has some of the best diving sites
Yeah.
in that area as well. And then we're also looking at a sort of a beach club there. So it's kind of the Mykonos of the Red Sea. So a little bit of a party area where youngsters can come and have fun. So it's being developed for all ages, but as I say, predominantly targeting the domestic audience.
So how do you, obviously your reputation precedes you, but how do you come across such projects? How are you, is it purely reputation based? Because you're from all around the world and you're based in London. It is brilliant to see, but it is purely based on reputation and in historic projects, I assume.
Yeah, so I mean, we get a lot of referrals, but the Saudi projects, they sort of, the internet is a wonderful tool,
Yeah.
and what's really nice is that many of our clients have done their research, so they'll go onto the internet. There's lots of wonderful practices out there, but if in terms of flood resilience and waterfront development, our name will appear quite high
Yeah.
on the listings, and then people look at the work. We don't sort of do beige, boring projects. Our designs have an element of playfulness in them.
Yeah.
You know, we try to create. I mean, we have a very clear methodology in how we deliver a project. We look at the site, we look at the environmental parameters. We'll work very closely with the client or the operator about where their brand sits, what do they want to deliver.
Yeah.
But most importantly, we then take that methodology and we look at how can we take elements locally
Hmm.
to make it unique to that context. And I think what our clients really enjoy is that no matter where we are, whether we're in Australia
Yeah.
or a little twee waterfront in the English countryside or in the middle of the Arabian desert, that those projects feel like they've always been there, that they have an integrity to them, and that when the visitors go there, whether you live there or, as I say, you're welcome there as a guest,
Yeah.
that that there's something memorable, and we hope that many of those visitors will go back to the sites because there's something about them that isn't this bland corporate brand, that there's something there that they feel that's catered to them personally.
Absolutely. Well, you shared with me in the last week or so some of these projects on a when we had a conversation before, and they are absolutely standalone and fabulous, and that is why it's your USP. You stand out from the crowd, and that's obviously why you're gaining such a reputation for the work that you do, which is all credit to you basically.
You're very kind, thank you.
So the practice itself, how do you look in terms of staff numbers, and do you engage with the part one through to the qualified with 20 years experience? How's the kind of business set up?
So the right hand guy that I work with is a gentleman called Robert Pattison, and Robert and I have been friends, colleagues for over 20 years. We were housemates at university,
Yep.
and we know each other's wives, we know their children, and we've been on a very long journey together. So there's some lovely things that we did when we started at university, at Sheffield University, and we were very lucky. We had some really great tutors,
Yeah.
and we were instilled from the very early days the value of sustainability. And this was way before it became the sort of the catchphrase, and
Yeah.
and and the, and so that instilled with us a really good foundation to work with. And I actually recall that when Robert and I were at university, we were invited to design a new school of architecture by the tutors. And as an architecture school, you would have thought your tutors would have been involved in the process, and
Hmm.
we quickly discovered that they weren't, and they were actually quite shy to this
Okay.
fact. We're happy to grow in the sphere of academia, but quite quite nervous about dealing with it in the real world.
Okay.
And so Robert and I kind of set up our own unit, and we went around to the estates department, and we said we hear you were going to design a new school of architecture, and they said, well, what's the brief for this? And I said, well, we don't really know. And so they asked us to then go and chat to the Department of Town Planning and the Department of Geography, and we interviewed all the heads of school, and we built up our own brief.
Okay.
Um, and then then we pulled that together, and we looked at the site, and we did our own massing studies, and we said, well, all of these four departments could come together under this beautiful design, but whilst preserving their own independence. And we created this grand hall where all of the lecture theatres would be combined, and the staircases would blend the different departments, so you would accidentally blend with the geography students as you go down the staircase.
Yeah.
And so it was a little bit of social engineering, but in a very sort of polite way, in that the dinner halls, you would all eat together, and hopefully this cross-fertilization of ideas would work. And so we built this giant model. We did this beautiful proposal, but we did get quite a frosty response from our school.
Okay.
But in the end, that work has formed the DNA of this practice.
Yeah.
And almost every single project that has come to fruition since follows that DNA. Go and see the people. What do they want? What do they want within their buildings? How can we, as a designer, create a really wonderful environment for them that actually either makes them more money or creates a place that just stimulates engagement?
Well, those are some core fantastic ethos to stand by, isn't it? Really, it's and if that's the foundation of, if you have strong ethics and you set out your stall from day one, which you clearly have done, then that's the strong foundations for a fantastic business, which you've clearly got and you've built on. When did the practice form?
Oh, I think it was just in the 2010s.
Okay, yeah, so we're 15 years old, yeah.
And then we link up with a couple of the universities. So we do so we take students through from part one and part two, and we offer active mentorship here. And there's a couple of universities, I think it's Westminster and Sheffield, also do the architectural apprentices as well.
Hmm.
So we will then take students for a couple of more years and then co-sponsor them through their final stages. And then, I mean, this is why it's quite nice within the practice. So at the smaller scale, we'll do like an amphibious unit.
Yeah.
And at the larger scale, we may even be doing a master plan for 100,000 homes.
Okay.
And depending on your skill set, you'll work across a whole broad range of skills. And I think in my very early days of my career, as I talked about Sheffield University again, one of the visiting professors was a gentleman called Dr. Ken Yang. And he is an Asian-based architect. He's Chinese Malay, and he designed hairy skyscrapers. And actually, that's where I went to work for my first job for a year and a half.
Hmm.
And what I really liked about the office, it was very non-hierarchical. And whether you were a part one or a senior architect, you would have a debate about design, and people would talk about the pros and cons, and people would sketch live, and he would help filter what were the best ideas. And it was not how many years you'd been at the firm. And I've worked in architectural practices where that does happen.
Yeah.
But the encouragement was, what's the best idea that this can be? And I really enjoyed working there. And as I say, as a part one student, I
Yeah.
was given a skyscraper and then was on site. And it's the same here with my team, is
Yeah.
that we take a very, very similar approach. And I say, just mentioning back to Ken still very kindly writes the forwards to my book. So say with all of the projects that we do, we develop friendships. We love collaboration, particularly with engineers, ecologists, landscape architects as well, because that brings a richness. And also it's about perspective. You can stand on one mountain, you see a distant building, but if you're stood on another mountain, your perspective is different. And
Yeah.
it's very important to hear those collective voices.
It's refreshing to hear. It's fantastic to listen to, and your story, the 15 years to date, and with many more years to come, sounds fabulous. So absolutely all credit to you, and the practice is clearly doing very well, and there's some fantastic things to come still. And I look forward to following the journey. And the audience that's listening to this now will hopefully come to your website, and I'm obviously sharing some of your work for you as well, which is wonderful. And yeah, no, all credit, and long may that continue.
Well, one thing, just in brief, if people are interested in the work, if you go
Mm.
onto our website, at the top there's a tab which says research, particularly for students
Yeah.
or for other colleagues. And if you download those, you will find we put some case studies on there.
Okay.
So, for example, if it's an amphibious house you're interested, there will be the main working bones of that, plus the Q&A. So as we talk with journalists, there's lots of questions that we keep getting asked. You'll find that because we get a lot of students that approach us for dissertations.
Yes, yeah.
And then there's case studies on some of the larger projects. So if you're in academia, please do visit that. It will signpost you to some very helpful material.
That's I'll make sure to include the a link to the website in this podcast as well, so people can just clearly click through, which is brilliant. And again, I do get a lot of students come to me, but I'm not an architect. I've got a military background. I've worked with architects for 25 plus years, although I only look 30. It's yeah. But yeah, I get asked a lot of questions because of the work that I do, and it's wonderful to be able to send people your way so that they can look at the work that you've done and get the information they need. So
Wonderful. That's great, Nick. Well, really appreciate that.
yeah, no, and look, thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate your time, and please do keep up the fabulous work and keep sharing it with us, for me to share within Architecture Vogue and get it to that audience. And thank you for everything that you've done, and it's wonderful to see.
Brilliant. Thanks again, then, Nick.
Thanks, Richard.